Welcome to our historic video, Manitowish Waters Historical Society Research Updates on Area Ojibwa Culture, the Civilian Conservation Corps, Southgate's Canal, Dillinger Gang's Escape, and Geological Exploration from the 1840s. This presentation is part of an ongoing collaboration between Dillmans and the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. This presentation was created and narrated by Jim Bokern and is not intended to be a comprehensive history of White Sand Lake, rather a series of highlights of new research delivering greater historic insights. And if you look at the first image, you can see White Sand Lake front and center. And most of our coverage will be about White Sand Lake or themes that link through White Sand Lake itself. Go to the very beginning. For over 10,000 years, Native communities have utilized the area of White Sand Lake and the surrounding North Woods in all portions of the year to gather crucial resources. New research illustrates that in 1846, a Lac du Flambeau chief by the name of White Thunder was occupying a summer residence on Cross Lake. If you look at the middle of the image, you can see Cross Lake right between Turtle Lake and Trout Lake. I believe that this is Rest Lake because of the evidence and citations that support at least a seasonal residence on the end of what is now Fox Island. White Thunder was documented by A.B. Gray, a geologist, as being a tall and athletic-looking Indian. They had met previously at La Pointe, where White Thunder had collected his annuities from the federal government. This creates a strong linkage between Lac du Flambeau due to the fact that White Thunder was a signatory of the very important 1837 treaty for the Ojibwa. And he was cited in the signing of that treaty as a Lac du Flambeau chief, showing those strong connections between what we call Manitowish Waters today and Lac du Flambeau. If you look at the 1847 map, which is part of a second geological survey attached to the Owen expedition, you can look at the different Ojibwa communities that surround Lac du Flambeau. In the upper left, you have the Turtle Portage Band, which is located in Mercer. To the upper right, you see the blue arrow pointing at Trout Lake, and that would be the Trout Lake Band. In the lower left, you see the traditional site for the Lac du Flambeau Band of the Ojibwa. The yellow arrow shows the trading post quite distinctly and makes it a key connection to White Sand Lake as traders went through White Sand Lake to Ike Walton Lake to connect with both Manitowish Waters and the Trout River Band. In his journal, J.G. Norwood talks about traveling from the fur trade post, and they talk about moving across Pokagama Lake and then taking the portage to White Sand Lake. White Sand Lake in the map was Whippanog, which was an important link for all Ojibwa travel. We see this reinforced also in Malio's journals as a French fur trader in Lac du Flambeau in 1804. J.G. Norwood was the officer in charge of the Owen expedition surveys in Lac du Flambeau and the regions on the south shore of Lake Superior. Norwood spoke specifically about the difficulty in traveling on September 28th in 1847, facing terribly high winds as he portaged from Little Sand Lake to Ike Walton Lake. It's an interesting story that's highlighted that once they made it 2/3 of the way across the lake, a huge gale pushed up. For those who know Ike Walton Lake well, the northwest portion of the lake is very shallow and can create some amazing waves that Norwood put on par with Lake Superior. Their boats were nearly sunk and soaked, and on the central islands of Ike Walton Lake, they spent the night to repair and refresh before taking the difficult portage to the Trout River. And then ultimately they made their way both by boat and by trail to the Trout River Band of the Ojibwa. This narrative is among the best from the 19th century that illustrates the importance of White Sand Lake and its key linkages. Historic Ojibwa communities flourished throughout the region. Trout Lake, Turtle Portage, and Lac du Flambeau bands would have their members move throughout the region, just like White Thunder on Cross or Rest Lake. And these 19th century images will give you an idea of what those communities or camps might have looked like. Wild rice was absolutely essential to Ojibwa survival. It was part of their prophecy of moving from the East Coast to find where food grows on water. The construction of logging dams at the end of the 19th century threatened many of these important resources that are both illustrated in the image to the left and depicted historically by Seth Eastman in the 1850s to the right. Recently, the Manitowish Waters Historical Society discovered this image from 1909 illustrating Ojibwe from the Manitowish area, probably Turtle Portage Band or Lac du Flambeau Band, displaying wild rice and other important cultural traditions. If anyone knows about this image or can identify any of the persons who are in it, please contact the Manitowish Waters Historical Society so we can share this with other interested researchers. The importance of wild rice and travel through the area of White Sand Lake is going to be followed through a series of maps. We're going to start with the first significant maps created by the government, the original survey maps. From 1862, you can start on the lower left and see Pokagama Lake. And then the first yellow arrow is the portage that was described before. And then across White Sand to Little Sand, the portage to Swamp Lake, as it's cited here by the original surveys, but that's Ike Walton today. And then an important yellow arrow that moves up to Wild Rice Lake, and certainly one above that that ultimately will link to Island Lake. This is one corridor of critical travel that involves White Sand Lake. But if you also look at the portage, which is drawn on the original survey, I put in the orange arrows that show an overland route all the way to the Trout Lake Band as well, showing this kind of important hub or corridor influence that White Sand Lake had and its area of high usage. If we move north of Wild Rice Lake, you see another series of arrows going from the bay at what is the old Woody's Resort, or originally the Bakken Resort, traveling all the way to the southern shore of Island Lake. This route was absolutely key and probably was utilized as a portage route and as a toboggan route to access already identified key maple sugaring sites on Island Lake. The top arrow shows Rice Creek and the importance of Rice Creek in providing travel to Big Lake, which becomes a critical wild ricing site after the dams are constructed in the 1890s. Even from Big Lake, as we see in this part of the original survey, The trail then continues all the way to Crab Lake, across the Continental Divide, and linking Lac du Flambeau all the way to the Lake Superior Basin. This 1878 Army Corps of Engineers map basically shows all the routes from the original surveys that I just shared with you. And the yellow arrow in the upper right illustrates Big Lake and Rice Creek, which were critical in the 1890s into the 20th century for providing Lac du Flambeau Ojibwa critical wild rice resources. So the route is then all linked together. What is important for you to understand is that this map from the Army Corps of Engineers shows the effects of dams. And if you see the red outlines around Rest Lake, Clear Lake, Island Lake, Rice Creek in the upper portion, and down in Lac du Flambeau at Pokegama Lake, Flambeau Lake, and Crawling Stone Lakes, when the water was raised, traditional ricing crops were destroyed, creating a huge challenge to the Ojibwa within the region. Note that Big Lake is above the influences of those dams and became a more critical site. Again, White Sand Lake is part of those linkages. The next thing that we're going to be exploring is one of the more unique developments in the North Woods that connect Manitowish Waters and Lac du Flambeau, and that is Southgate's and Hughitt's canal system that link the two communities. To the left, you see a historic map that shows the canals as they were dug into Swamp Lake, again, Ike Walton Lake, from Big Crooked into Little Trout Lake. On the right, I've overlaid most of the canals within the system in red so you can see where they existed. The Southgate Canal system was established in 1897 according to caretaker Robert Loveless. The community that was built on Little Trout Lake was called Bobtown or Bobstown. From an excerpt of a journal from Mr. Loveless, he claims to have started working on Little Trout Lake for Marvin Hughitt and Richard Southgate in 1897. In the next series of slides, I will be grouping several citations together that illustrates the development of the Southgate Canal. The document illustrated here was that on a 1,000-acre lake at Bobtown, that's where Southgate was spending much of his time. The yellow arrow shows right on Little Trout Lake on the Lac du Flambeau Manitowish Waters Township where this estate was created. He created a one-of-a-kind fishing paradise with Marvin Hughitt, who was the vice president of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. Hughitt was instrumental in providing backing, labor, and financing for this super ambitious project. Dolly Turpie gives us insights from her father sharing as caretaker how the Southgate family lived on Little Trout Lake. Huge expenditures for French champagne and barrels of live lobster were common. Both Richard and Ella chose an open marriage, and their boyfriends and girlfriends also joined them at Little Trout Lake. More than a fishing paradise, this became an area where the wealthy were able to be free from the scrutiny of the public. We can see the Chicago Tribune on January 21st, 1900, talks about Southgate being insolvent and going through bankruptcy. In the same year, he was headed up to Little Trout Lake and his estate, as illustrated by the yellow arrow. Certainly, Southgate was in the papers. Southgate and Hughitt's canal became embedded in the maps of the region, and the connection between Alder Lake and Little Trout Lake was used extensively in the early part of the 20th century. The Northwestern Railroad did much of the initial labor for digging these canals. If you look at the top document, dated in 1901, the name and address for Southgate is now in Lac du Flambeau, even though he owned the Congress Hotel in Chicago. At what point Southgate was living a dual life, one in operating his corporate interests, mostly hotels, in Chicago, and moving to his retreat on Little Trout Lake through a canal system. The image in this slide is arguably some of the most important evidence regarding the Southgate retreat on Little Trout Lake and the canal system. It illustrates that Bobtown was operational by 1898. Therefore, the canals and many of the structures that became part of his storied estate were operational before the 20th century. The man on the front of this image is Southgate himself. To the far left, Robert Loveless. This is a lock system and boathouse on the canal outlet from Little Trout Lake as it would travel into Alder Lake. As you can see from the blue arrows of the property owned by Southgate on Little Trout Lake, his canal would then move across to Alder Lake itself. The blue arrows show all of the different land that Southgate had purchased to make the canal operational. Southgate did not purchase any land in Lac du Flambeau, and details to be reviewed a little bit later suggest that he and perhaps Hughitt entered into a clandestine agreement with an Indian agent in Lac du Flambeau to allow their access through tribal lands. This diorama of the Southgate property was created by Stephen Bartling, and he was supervised by his grandfather, Cal Laporte. Cal's father, George Laporte, was also a caretaker in the last days of the Southgate estate. You can see Little Trout Lake, the main house, the canal lock that we saw in the last 1898 picture to the left, and the canal itself making its way to Alder Lake. Straight on, the canal was behind several of the initial buildings that created the retreat that was so prized by Marvin Hughitt, Southgate, and their numerous guests. The lake view shows an impressive property with more than a caretaker's house, dance halls, and other kind of entertainment opportunities flourished on Southgate's estate, having a generator, electricity, and even a still that will appear probably later in the 1920s. Sadly, the famous Powell Marsh fires that raged for several years during the 1930s wiped out all but one of these buildings. These images of the Trout Lake to Alder Lake Canal are absolutely impressive, showing the amount of effort that was taken by first railroad interests under Hughitt's guidance, and then later by tribal members of Lac du Flambeau to both build and maintain the canal. The locks to the left illustrate the apparatus used to move boats and supplies back and forth from the Northwest Railroad station just above Headflyer Lake. The canal locks and boathouse above Alder Lake are depicted quite well, with these two women in the forefront of the picture. Looking across at Loveless's property on the east side of Alder Lake, we also see a nice boathouse that was there that would hold many of Southgate's prized boats. In the beginning of the canal, you can see boardwalks follow the canal, and people actually fished in the canal system itself. Also, canoers and people who weren't really even guests of Southgate were allowed to use the canal and network between Manitowish Waters and Lac de Flambeau. One of the most impressive pictures is this large wooden launch that Robert Loveless had on Alder Lake. Dolly Turpey claims that the canals were large enough to move this impressive boat all the way through the canal systems from Little Trout Lake to Alder Lake. In 1970, the Lakeland Times ran a series of articles regarding the canal system and included this image of the canals as they still exist today in Lac de Flambeau. By 1911, Richard Southgate became very ill, and Robert Loveless had become Southgate's dear friend. Loveless was called to Southgate's bedside, but Southgate will die by 1912. What happens next leads to a series of mishaps that will ultimately lead to the demise of Southgate's estate. Ella marries one of her boyfriends from their open marriage by the name of Richard Hines. He accumulates much of the wealth that Southgate had accumulated and invests that into oil shale in the American West. This speculation will prove to be disastrous. Through investigations, we have discovered that in Colorado, Mr. Hines was having his oil shale assessed to see the quality of the oil shale he was going to use to bring oil to market. Ultimately, the oil shale market will collapse, all the monies invested will be gone, and Hines will ultimately work as a bellhop, ironically, at the Congress Hotel in Chicago. If you look to the right, in 1918, Ella Southgate had to sue investors within the Congress Hotel to get back all of her assets and the wealth that Richard Southgate had accumulated. She was successful in doing so. During this time period, though, Marvin Hughitt had pretty much removed himself from the Southgate fishing retreat on Little Trout Lake. Certainly, since the death of Richard Southgate, things had become more than awkward. Hughitt moved from the yellow arrow in the map in the lower left on Little Trout Lake to Thousand Island Lake, where the red arrow is in the upper right, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, part of the Cisco chain and near what is Sylvania today. In moving there, Hughitt will design a fishing paradise with many similarities to the estate that Southgate had created. Marvin Hughitt's estate, known as Maplewood, will actually be run by Robert Loveless's brother, hired as the caretaker, as well as other members of the Loveless family. In 1918, the Maplewood estate was featured with dignitaries like Kermit Roosevelt, that would be the son of Theodore Roosevelt, and others on the properties. The lavish interiors of the Hughitt estate, as illustrated here, were said to be second rate to what Southgate had on Little Trout Lake. Hughitt didn't use canals, being a railroad man. He used railroads and devised these automobiles or vehicles that could portage canoes and material from lake to lake in the area of the Cisco Chain and what we call now the Sylvania Wilderness. This 1910 document, recently discovered by a Manitowish Waters Historical Society researcher, Kay Crons, illustrates that the contested nature of the canal within the tribe of Lac du Flambeau. Specifically, John Patterson spoke in a hearing questioning Southgate's ownership of the canal and seeking compensation for the canal running through his son's land. So, identifying both Southgate and considerable damage, he was trying to receive compensation. More than that, we will find that the government agent in the area threatened Mr. Patterson with giving up their land if they provoked a challenge to Southgate. Ultimately, through investigations, the damages were done by a gentleman named Herrick, who is unknown to me, who created a dam somewhere along the canal, flooding Mr. Patterson's property. That would be a good mystery for locals to research from White Sand Lake to find out where the Herrick Dam was and what its influence may have been. Ultimately, this seemed to have been resolved, but it illustrated that the Indian agents in Lac du Flambeau created, whether in a tacit or formal agreement, a process by which Richard Southgate and Hughitt could dig these extensive canals and have them operate. Area camps began to spring up in the early part of the 20th century, and interestingly, documents from both Camp Manitowish on Boulder Lake and proposed Camp Michiki on Harris Lake in Winchester featured or traveled through the canal routes, encountering great cultural connections with Lac du Flambeau tribal members. The Camp Michiki experiment was going to create an outdoor camp similar to other outdoor camps of the time, generated from the rising urbanization and the fear that many of the young men and women in America would lose touch with our pioneering and wilderness roots. Camp Michiki will never be put into full operation, but they will create an elaborate promotional document and put together a curriculum. Their mission was beyond the end of the trail. If you look at the wilderness tripping, forestry, woodcraft, and environmental awareness, Camp Michiki wanted also to tie very closely to Ojibwa culture and featured this amazing picture to the right in their publication showing their intention to using the canal to link with the Lac du Flambeau tribal community. Again, showing the importance of the canal, this connection, and the fact that the canal was used more than by just the Southgate group. In 1921, an amazing journal from Camp Manitowish also illustrates the use of the canal. Coming to Alder Lake from traveling from Boulder Lake, they came into the canal itself that would take them to Little Trout Lake. The water was opened up and they were able to move their canoes through and only had to portage at the very end. They were amazed by the number of cranberries and dewberries that were throughout the canal region, and they captured 50 frogs for supper. The bullfrogs augmented their provisions. What was interesting, on the next day, after spending time on Little Trout Lake, they moved through the canal to Big Crooked and then Sunfish Lake. En route, they found a fish trap within the canal as Ojibwa were using the canal to catch important food for their families. But in addition, they found Chippewa Indians, specifically women and children, making baskets for the Indian Fair. This reference to the Indian Fair is important because it was a way in which Ojibwa in the Lac du Flambeau region could sell traditional cultural artifacts to tourists and some locals to add to their resources. The detail of chewing choke cherries and then pulling strips of basswood through their mouths, coloring the strips, provides for this historian vivid details on the quality and the care that Ojibwa put into making works of art. As the Camp Manitowish campers proceeded from Sunfish Lake, they made their way to White Sand Lake, once again a hub of travel. And as the yellow arrow on the right-hand picture illustrates, and the green arrow on the left-hand picture illustrates, they crossed Sand Lake and they camped at the Portage campsite. So those residents on the west side of White Sand Lake need to understand that this was an important trade route and travel route into the 1920s. Next, we're going to follow the entire route of the canal system starting on Alder Lake, moving all the way through to Headflyer Lake. Looking at Alder Lake, there were many logistical support points for the canal travel. We're going to go into the detail of each of these. At the outlet of the Trout River was the old Levine homestead, but Cal Laporte reported that previous to that time, the small lagoon that is dug into the shore is where Southgate and his guest would spend the night and protect their boats. They would then travel to the western side of the lake, perhaps keeping boats in the boathouse or using the boathouse as a staging area. They began the journey up the canal and through the locks. It's a long trip from Alder Lake to Little Trout Lake and the Southgate Estate property. The yellow arrow on the shore of Little Trout Lake illustrates precisely where the Southgate property was, and the canal filled right behind the buildings. Also, a large rise of high ground is a suggested site for a still that probably operated well after Southgate's death, but serviced the guest who lived along the shores of Trout Lake and possibly even exported some of their product under the leadership of Richard Himes and Ella Southgate. Traveling across Little Trout Lake into the bay where the boat landing is today, the canal will proceed to Big Crooked Lake, utilizing a small pothole lake. Then, once in Big Crooked, the canals actually split, one going to Ike Walton, the other to Sunfish Lake. From Big Crooked to Sunfish Lake, The canals exit from the south side of Big Crooked and enter into Sunfish Lake. Recall that the Camp Manitowish group in 1921 encountered an Ojibwa summer camp there. It might be a fun mystery to kind of hypothesize where that encounter may have taken place. Also, we may want to think back to Mr. Patterson's complaint and where the Herrick Dam may have been built that damaged his property so much. Even though these images were taken 25 years later, they still may provide some important clues. The trip to Ike Walton Lake seemed to be solely for fishing purposes. Ike Walton is a storied lake for excellent fishing and having actually a diverse amount of structure on the lake that fishermen prize. And this would be part of Southgate and Hughitt's long-term goal, to be able to, in the privacy of their canal system, access elite fisheries. From Sunfish Lake, the canal will then meander all the way to White Sand Lake and enter about the center north part of White Sand Lake. Within White Sand Lake itself from Sunfish, the Northwestern Railroad comes very close, but that wasn't the primary point of access. The primary railroad station was on the south side of Headflyer Lake, and the canal still exists there today. That's not to say that on occasion the west side of Sand Lake may have been used to service the canal or the guests of Southgate and Hughitt, but documents, canals, and local stories support the Headflyer Lake as being the primary route of access. This is truly a unique part of Wisconsin history. It's even more fascinating that Hughitt will escape the Southgate estate and create his own fishing paradise on Thousand Island Lake, illustrating that the elites from the Midwest really sought the great wilderness experiences and isolation that the cities couldn't afford them. In retrospect, and on the overview of all the documents, it seems curious that Southgate would lead all of these activities, particularly with his financial problems that were discussed earlier. It is plausible that Southgate was a frontman for Marvin Hughitt, a man of great money, who will ultimately become the president of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad. At any rate, a lot of local lore and stories suggest that other activities utilized the Southgate Canal. These stories suggest that extra-legal activities and destinations were also a part of the canal system. Moving from the canals to a great tradition throughout the entire United States, Lac du Flambeau, White Sand Lake, and the entire North Woods. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Tree Army, helped bring relief, recovery, and reform to America. In particular in the North Woods, much of the environmental reclamation that we enjoy today were brought to us by a broad scope of residents serving in the CCC. A national program that empowered rural communities and families like never before. It was a massive undertaking, providing not only work and income relief for families, but education for those who participated. How it began? FDR saw that in the first 100 days, America needed support. and the CCC became one of the most important and popular New Deal reforms in America. The picture below is lifted from a film which identifies Lac du Flambeau as one of the better CCC camps in the Indian Division group. During the Depression, CCC camps offered a lot of support. In the 1930s and 40s, the yellow arrow marks Camp Mercer, or the 660th Company, which was the administrative camp for mostly white enrollees, whereas the orange arrow at Pokegama Lake illustrates the administrative camp for Indian Division CCC camps throughout the UP and northern Wisconsin. Importantly, these two camps played sports against one another and cooperated. Actually, in the 1940s, the Camp Mercer basketball team would actually travel to Lac du Flambeau to practice in their facilities. Many of their goals were absolutely aligned, but their means and operative models were quite different. Wisconsin and Minnesota were unique throughout the United States by having integrated CCC camps for African American enrollees. You can see in this image from Blue Lake for the Minocqua CCC camp, where an African American enrollee was photographed in the 1937 Sparta yearbook. Again, the image below illustrates the top-notch effort at the Ojibwa CCC camp on Pokegama Lake, and they played the role of a strong administrative camp throughout the New Deal. If you take a look at the map on the left, the yellow arrow will show exactly where the Pokegama or Lac du Flambeau CCC camp was located. To the right, you see an older map that shows the Pokegama area being developed for its fish hatcheries and also some of the farming that was done at the turn of the century. If you look at the Camp Mercer efforts and those of integrated camps of African Americans and white Americans, they had basically 4 different kinds of CCC camps, 3 of which were present in the North Woods. The red arrow would represent state parks and state park improvement like you'd find in Copper Falls. The yellow would be state forestry programs. That would be Camp Mercer, marked by the yellow arrow, working with state forest rangers. And finally, the new federal forests were getting support with their own CCC camps, as you see with the green arrow over in the Nicolet Forest. FDR recruited thousands of unemployed men and was going to try to do a massive salvage operation to improve the environment of the United States. The Dust Bowl and erosion and the effect of clear cutting and logging in this region gave these men plenty of work. CCC camps tended to be located in rural areas, a bit out of town, and close to railroad depots for logistical support. The Indian Division camps followed that model as well. This is the CCC Indian Division movie that I spoke of earlier that talked about how the CCC was making significant changes for Native Americans throughout the United States. Cindi Stiles, retired archaeologist for the Lac du Flambeau Historic Preservation Office, gave us some keen insights about the administrative camp in Lac du Flambeau, that it reached all the way to the UP, and in Marquette, it was unusual because in Marquette, it was the first desegregated camp with natives and whites working together. It was very successful, but ultimately would be closed by the government. Interestingly, Camp Mercer had African American enrollees and Native American enrollees not from Lac du Flambeau, but from Odena. Back in Lac du Flambeau, this is a classic image celebrating the Lac du Flambeau CCCID camp and its operations. This image is very revealing because it has a boxing ring to the right. Athletics, whether basketball, boxing, baseball, and alike, were all part of the experience of those who were part of the CCC. The Lac du Flambeau CCC camp was known to have outstanding athletes and teams. The Office of Indian Affairs proudly selected Lac du Flambeau as an exemplar for the CCCID programs. You can click on the YouTube link below and actually see the whole video. I have done some screenshots of that film and included them in this presentation. The hospital, recreation, barracks, and alike will all be representative of a fine-run camp. CCC Indian Division camps were given greater autonomy. They could select and promote projects that would be most beneficial to the community, whether on the litany of physical improvements or development of natural resources. Many of these traditions continue in the tribal government today. Importantly, families benefited from the CCC camps, and if you look at the table below, Lac du Flambeau actually was one of the largest users of CCC ID opportunities, employment, and leveraged that to bring significant environmental reform to the reservation and surrounding lands. Importantly, non-Ojibwe men were often part of the Indian Division camps to provide instruction and administrative roles. To the right, connecting with White Sand Lake, Marvin Hughitt served as a manager of the Lac du Flambeau CCC Indian Division camp. Fire tower construction and fire prevention were some of the most important elements of what the CCC did in the North Woods. And the fire tower by White Sand Lake is another important link of White Sand Lake to the efforts of this national movement. If we take a look at all the fire towers in the region, to the left in Iron County, from Pine Lake to Mercer to Springstead, and the right in Vilas County, from Rest Lake to Lac du Flambeau, right off of White Sand Lake, these towers would work independently to cite fires and use telephone systems built by the CCC to relay coordinates back to headquarters. By triangulating these coordinates quickly with telephones, the response time increased dramatically and the impact on fire suppression was dramatic. One of the things that is often overlooked as far as the connections between Manitowish Waters and Lac du Flambeau is the famous Dillinger Shootout. The image below is the location of the Blue Bayou restaurant today and the Highway 51 bridge in Manitowish Waters. What most people don't know is this was the site of some of the most gruesome violence from the Dillinger Shootout. So the 1934 map below from the Little Bohemia restaurant shows two yellow arrows where the two different gunfights took place. The arrow on the left on Little Star Lake was where the FBI botched their raid, mistakenly gunning down two CCC enrollees from Camp Mercer and a resident from Mercer, Wisconsin, alerting Dillinger and his gang. What follows is a melee of escapes by Dillinger's gang. Dillinger moved toward Rest Lake and fled, while the notorious gangster Babyface Nelson moved down along Highway 51 and hijacked a car and ultimately ended up where the yellow arrow indicates on the right side of the image at Kerner's Resort. Babyface Nelson was well armed, as illustrated by the image on the left of weapons left behind at Little Bohemia. The tragedy took place in front of this house on Kerner's Resort. It is at this location where the wrath of the Dillinger Gang comes down hard on law enforcement. Manitowish Waters Constable Carl Christensen was shot 8 times. Carter Baum, FBI agent, was shot in the throat and died at the scene, and the other FBI agent had a seemingly lethal glancing blow to his head. The death of Carter Baum and the escape of Babyface Nelson brought incredible shame to the FBI. And interestingly, this nearly $10 billion a year operation today went through systemic reform in its field operations because of the errors and bungling that took place at numerous locations in Manitowish waters. But the tragedy and problems don't end there. The yellow arrow on the map left shows Nelson escaped going down Highway 51. He made his way through the Powell Marsh all the way to Allie Catfish's cabin, which now rests on the Dillman Resort on White Sand Lake. Yes, indeed, the FBI errors continued as Babyface Nelson sought refuge and support on White Sand Lake, and ultimately will be able to flee to Minnesota and back to Illinois, where he ultimately encounters more FBI agents in Barrington, Illinois, and dies in a gun battle, but not before killing 2 more FBI agents. The fact that Babyface Nelson killed 3 active duty FBI agents puts him as one of the most lethal and notorious villains in the history of FBI law enforcement. I hope you've enjoyed our video regarding highlights of new research discovered by the Manitowish Waters Historical Society regarding White Sand Lake and the surrounding areas. We will continue to collaborate with Dillmans and to share information as it becomes available. I want to personally thank those members of the White Sand Lake community who have reciprocated and shared documents and information with me. If you're interested in learning more about the efforts at the Manitowish Waters Historical Society, you can use the email below to contact us and request free delivery by email of our newsletter 3 times a year, or even possibly join as members of our historical society. In either case, we hope you tune in and visit our website at mwhistory.org or our YouTube channel as we add more important stories regarding the North Woods. Thank you for your time.